From the very beginning, the mission of following Christ has never been simply to retell old religious stories. It has been to search for the moments that are harder to explain. The moments that seem to slip quietly between faith, mystery, and something beyond human understanding. Because throughout history, there have been strange events inside churches around the world. Moments so unexpected that even eyewitnesses struggled to describe what they felt. One of those moments took place in France in 2018. It was early morning inside the Catholic Church of St. Eustache. The building was almost empty. Sunlight barely touched the old stone floor, and the silence inside the sanctuary felt heavy in the way ancient churches sometimes do, as though generations of whispered prayers still lingered in the walls. Then the church doors slowly opened. A deer walked inside. Witnesses later described the scene with genuine confusion because the animal showed none of the behavior anyone would expect. It was not frightened by the enclosed space. It did not run in panic after realizing people were nearby. Instead, it moved calmly down the center aisle with an almost unnatural stillness, step by step, as though it had entered a place it recognized. The deer continued forward until it reached the area near the tabernacle. The sacred place Catholics believe contains the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. And there, it stopped. For several long moments, the animal stood completely still, staring toward the tabernacle in total silence. The church itself seemed frozen around it. Then, just as quietly as it had arrived, the deer turned and walked back out through the doors. By itself, the story already sounds unusual, but the detail that unsettled many people came afterward. The church the deer entered was named after Saint Eustache, the patron saint of hunters. According to Christian tradition, before his conversion, Eustache was a Roman soldier who encountered a stag in the forest and saw a vision of Christ appearing between its antlers. That vision changed the course of his life forever. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Not long after, another strange moment unfolded thousands of miles away inside a small church in Brazil. This time the visitor was a hummingbird. Church security cameras captured the tiny bird floating directly before the Holy Eucharist. At first, nothing seemed remarkable. Hummingbirds often dart unpredictably from place to place, but this one behaved differently. It hovered in front of the altar with unusual steadiness, almost suspended in the air. Its wings moved like a faint vibration inside the quiet chapel, while the bird remained fixed toward the Eucharist itself. Then came the moment that spread across social media and religious communities. The hummingbird descended slightly and lowered its head. Many viewers insisted it looked as though the bird was bowing. In Latin American culture, hummingbirds have long carried spiritual symbolism. Some traditions describe them as messengers between worlds, creatures associated with hope, joy, and the souls of the departed. Others see them as signs of peace or divine closeness. Inside that church, however, the symbolism became harder to separate from the atmosphere of the moment itself. The bird did not appear trapped. It did not behave erratically. It simply remained before the Eucharist, with a calmness that many people found deeply unsettling. For believers watching the footage later, the scene felt less like animal behavior and more like recognition. But perhaps the most fascinating account came during the 1995 visit of Pope John Paul II to the United States. The Pope was scheduled to stop briefly at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore. According to the original security plan, he would greet seminarians outside the building for only a few moments before leaving for the next event. Everything had already been arranged with military precision. Then John Paul II unexpectedly changed the plan. Without advance notice, he decided he wanted to enter the seminary chapel to pray before the Blessed Sacrament. The sudden decision created immediate concern among security personnel. The chapel had not been fully cleared. Agents quickly began emergency procedures, bringing in specially trained rescue dogs used in earthquake zones and disaster recovery operations. Animals capable of detecting human presence beneath concrete, rubble, and collapsed buildings. The dogs moved through hallways, classrooms, offices, and stairwells without hesitation. Then they entered the chapel. Witnesses said the dogs walked slowly down the center aisle toward the small side chapel where the Eucharist was reserved inside the tabernacle. That was when the behavior changed. The animals suddenly stopped. Handlers initially assumed they had detected movement or hidden human presence. But instead of searching further, the dogs fixed their attention directly toward the tabernacle. Several began whining softly. Others refused commands to move away. The handlers attempted to redirect them multiple times. The dogs resisted. These were not inexperienced animals reacting randomly to unfamiliar surroundings. They had spent years locating trapped survivors after natural disasters. Their training conditioned them to respond only when they sensed a living person nearby. Yet inside that chapel, they reacted exactly as they would at a rescue site where someone remained hidden from view. Except no one visible was there, only the Eucharist. The account spread quietly among seminarians and clergy who witnessed the event firsthand. For Catholics, it carried extraordinary weight because the central belief of the Eucharist is not symbolic remembrance. Catholic teaching insists that Christ is truly present there, body, blood, soul, and divinity. And according to those witnesses, the dogs behaved as though they sensed a living presence inside the silence of that chapel. Stories like these become even more intriguing when placed beside older events that many people today have almost forgotten. One of the most remarkable occurred in Portugal in 1946, during the nationwide celebration marking the 300th anniversary of the country's consecration to the Immaculate Conception. To honor the Virgin Mary, a statue of Our Lady of Fatima began a massive procession across Portugal, traveling from the original apparition site toward Lisbon. Crowds gathered in every town the procession entered, roads filled with candles, hymns, church bells, flower petals, and people kneeling as the statue passed by. Then, during one stage of the celebration on December 1st, 6 white doves were released into the sky as a public act of thanksgiving. Within seconds, 3 of the doves flew directly toward the statue and landed at the feet of Our Lady. At first, nobody thought much about it, but the birds never left. As the procession continued from city to city, the doves remained beside the statue through heat, exhaustion, noise, fireworks, and enormous crowds. Witnesses watched them sit motionless for hours while petals drifted through the air around them. People assumed eventually the birds would fly away in search of food or water. They did not. At times, the doves briefly lifted into the air, circled gently above the statue, and then returned again to the same place, almost as if deliberately accompanying the procession. Newspapers across Portugal began reporting the phenomenon. Photographs spread nationwide. Crowds became even larger as curiosity turned into fascination. For many witnesses, the most emotional moment came at night. Thousands of people walked through dark streets holding candles while hymns echoed across the city. Fireworks illuminated the sky above the statue, and beneath those flashes of light, the 3 white doves could still be seen resting quietly at the feet of Our Lady of Fatima. The journey finally reached Lisbon on December 5th ahead of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. 2 days later, thousands of children gathered at exactly 3 in the afternoon to consecrate themselves to the protection of the Virgin Mary. The city remained awake through the night with prayer vigils, candlelit processions, and overflowing churches. And through it all, the doves stayed. Night settled over Lisbon beneath thousands of trembling candle flames. The streets were overflowing with pilgrims. Hymns drifted through the cold evening air while incense rolled slowly above the crowd like pale smoke suspended between earth and heaven. Every sound, footsteps against stone, distant church bells, whispered prayers, merged into something larger than a public celebration. The entire city seemed to move with a single heartbeat. Then morning came. Inside the church, a solemn mass was offered in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The atmosphere was deeply still, filled with the low echo of sacred music and the murmur of quiet prayer. Many people had not slept the night before, yet no one wanted to leave. There was a growing sense that something unusual was unfolding around the statue of Our Lady of Fatima and the 3 white doves that had refused to abandon it throughout the long procession across Portugal. And during the liturgy, the mystery deepened. Without warning, 2 of the doves suddenly took flight. Witnesses watched in silence as one bird crossed gently toward the epistle side of the altar, while the other settled near the gospel side. Neither bird appeared frightened by the massive crowd, the candles, or the movement inside the sanctuary. They perched there calmly, facing the altar itself. Then came the moment that many people in attendance would later describe for the rest of their lives. As the bishops rose to elevate the consecrated host, both doves lowered their heads and folded their wings inward, remaining perfectly still during the elevation of the Eucharist. The church fell into stunned silence. To Catholics, this was the holiest moment of the Mass, the instant the Eucharist was lifted before the faithful. And there, before hundreds of witnesses, the birds appeared to respond with the same posture of reverence shown by the people kneeling below them. Yet the most unforgettable moment was still to come. The 3rd dove had remained where it always stayed, resting quietly at the feet of the statue of Mary. Then Holy Communion began. the bishop turned toward the congregation and raised the Eucharist high, proclaiming the ancient words, "Behold the Lamb of God." At that exact moment, the third dove suddenly rose into the air. The bird flew upward through the church and landed directly upon the crown of the statue of Our Lady. Then, as the Eucharist remained lifted before the people, the dove slowly opened its wings completely, brilliant white, almost suspended above the crowd. Witnesses described the scene as overwhelming, not because it felt theatrical, but because of how strangely timed it was. The symbolism unfolded with such precision that many struggled to explain it away afterward. It looked less like random animal behavior and more like a living image crafted inside the liturgy itself. A moment where heaven, nature, and worship appeared to intersect for only a few seconds before returning to silence. What makes stories like these endure is not merely their beauty. Again and again, the events revolve around the same focal points: the Eucharist, reverence, and the figure of Mary. A deer enters a church and stops before the tabernacle. A hummingbird hovers in silence before the Blessed Sacrament. Rescue dogs trained to locate human survivors react to the Eucharist as though someone unseen were physically present. Doves released into the sky refuse to leave the statue of Our Lady for days, then appear to respond during the holiest moments of the Mass itself. Skeptics hear these accounts and immediately search for ordinary explanations. And to some extent, that reaction is understandable. Animals behave unpredictably. Birds land in unusual places. Instinct can create strange coincidences. But what gives these stories their lasting power is the atmosphere surrounding them. The timing, the silence, the symbolic precision, and the emotional effect they leave behind on witnesses who were actually there. For centuries, Christians have spoken about creation responding to the presence of God. Ancient writers describe stars announcing Christ's birth, ravens feeding prophets in the wilderness, lions guarding saints, and birds gathering around holy men and women in the desert. Modern audiences often reduce those accounts to religious symbolism, yet stories like these continue appearing in places where nobody expected them. And perhaps that is why they remain so difficult to dismiss completely. At the center of many of these stories stands Mary. She is remembered as the young woman who accepted a frightening calling without fully understanding where it would lead. The mother who carried Christ before the world recognized him. The woman who remained at the foot of the cross after nearly everyone else fled. That image of quiet endurance has shaped Christian devotion for centuries. And perhaps that is why the story of the doves in Portugal affected people so deeply. The birds did not circle above kings or politicians. They remained at the feet of a mother millions of believers turn to in grief, fear, loneliness, and prayer. In today's world, surrounded by constant noise, endless distraction, and relentless speed, stories like these can seem small compared to headlines and spectacle. Yet that may be exactly why they continue to resonate, because they force people to pause, to notice, to reconsider whether reverence is something humanity has slowly forgotten, while the natural world, in its own strange way, still remembers. And perhaps the deepest question hidden beneath all these stories is not whether the animals understood something supernatural. Perhaps the real question is far more uncomfortable. How often have human beings stood before the sacred with less awareness than they did?